The room smelled of paper and steel, sharp and unyielding, like every decision Gabriel Whitmore had ever made. He stood at the edge of his office, framed by towering glass windows that overlooked Manhattan. The skyline glowed with the last breath of sunset, but there was no warmth in his gaze. His hands were clasped tightly behind his back, his stance precise, disciplined, the way it always was. On the desk before him lay a document, its black letters stark against the white page. To anyone else, it was a contract, but to him it was a shield. Across from him, Sophie Lane sat in the leather chair, her back straight but her hands pressed tightly together in her lap. She had read the document line by line until the words blurred. She had stared at the clause so many times that it felt branded into her skin. No touching, no sharing a bed, no emotion, no risk. The words should have broken her, but instead she found herself clinging to them. Distance was safety. Silence was protection. Gabriel turned, finally, his gray eyes landing on her with the force of someone used to commanding boardrooms, not hearts. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of finality. If you're having second thoughts, now is the time to walk away. Her lips parted, but no sound came at first. She inhaled, steadying herself, and then answered quietly, "I'm not." Her voice was soft, fragile almost, but it did not waver. "As long as the rules are respected." Something flickered in Gabriel's expression, but it was gone too quickly to name. He gave the smallest nod, a gesture so restrained it felt rehearsed. He reached for the pen, uncapped it, and with precise, almost surgical movements, signed his name across the final page. His handwriting was sharp, exact, just like him. The air seemed to shift as the contract was sealed. This wasn't love. It wasn't even partnership. It was servile, dressed in legal terms. Gabriel needed the appearance of stability to protect his inheritance, and Sophie needed the distance of rules to protect herself from touch. To him, love was a liability. To her, it was a wound that never stopped bleeding. A week later, the courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly as if mocking the silence. Two witnesses stood stiffly at the back of the room, strangers who would forget their faces before the day was done. There were no vows exchanged, no rings slipped onto trembling fingers, just ink scratching against paper and the quiet slam of a clerk's stamp. Sophie didn't wear white. She wore navy, modest and unassuming, her hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Gabriel wore a dark suit, immaculate as ever, his tie knotted with military precision. Their eyes met once as the clerk announced them legally bound, but there was no smile, no flicker of joy. It was an exchange, nothing more. When they left the building, the sky had already dimmed into evening. Cars rushed past, horns echoing against the stone. Gabriel opened the door of the waiting car for her, his hand steady but never extended. Sophie slid inside, her breath catching for just a moment as the door shut with a hollow thud. As the city blurred by outside the window, a question formed in the silence between them, one neither dared to speak. What kind of marriage can survive when built on silence, distance, and rules meant to keep them apart? Neither answered. They sat in their separate corners of the leather seat, shadows pressed against glass, two strangers bound by a contract that forbade the very thing they both feared most: closeness. The mansion on the edge of New York was all glass and stone, sharp lines against the hills, a place meant to impress shareholders, not shelter hearts. When Sophie first stepped inside, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It was silent, so silent that even her footsteps on the marble floor seemed like intrusions. Gabriel walked ahead of her, his stride confident and measured, not once looking back to see if she followed. He showed her the West Wing with a gesture of his hand, nothing more. "These rooms are yours," he said, and then turned away. No welcome, no warmth, only boundaries. Her new world was vast but empty. She unpacked slowly in a room too large for comfort, placing a few soft blankets on the bed, a plant by the window, an old easel she had not touched in years. She tried to make the space her own, but the silence swallowed every attempt. At night, the wind pressed against the glass walls and she lay awake, heart racing, waiting for shadows from her past to creep into the room. She told herself the contract made her safe, but the loneliness made her wonder if safety was just another kind of prison. Gabriel lived in the East Wing, far enough that she rarely saw him. His days began before sunrise and ended long after dark. The housekeeper brought food to the long mahogany table, but dinners were a ritual of silence. Silverware clinked in echoing rhythm while two people who were legally bound sat worlds apart. Sometimes their eyes met, but only for a flicker, like lightning across a stormy sky. He never asked questions, and she never offered answers. Still, she caught something in his gaze, not desire, not cruelty, but an awareness that unsettled her more than indifference. The first crack in their distance came without warning. Sophie dropped a coffee mug one morning and it shattered across the marble floor. The sharp sound cut through the silence like a scream. Before she could even kneel, Gabriel appeared beside her. His suit was still immaculate, his movements controlled, but his hand brushed hers as he reached for the broken pieces. The contact lasted less than a second, but it froze her blood. She pulled back so quickly that the edge of the glass cut her palm. A thin line of red welled on her skin. Gabriel stood, his face unreadable, and without another word he left the room. That night she found a small first aid kit outside her door. No note, no explanation, only quiet care. From then on she felt him near even when he was not in the room. She noticed the faint music that drifted from his wing late at night, not the sharp classical she expected, but low jazz, lonely and restless. She noticed how he moved through the house with deliberate quiet as if he was careful not to disturb her. She noticed how he never looked too long, but never failed to see her. And though she told herself not to care, the silence between them began to change. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like waiting. One evening, a storm rolled over the hills. Sophie stepped outside barefoot, letting the rain soak her hair and cling to her skin. She stood on the stone terrace with her eyes closed, breathing in the thunder. Inside, Gabriel watched from behind the glass. He did not open the door. He did not call her in. But he did not look away either. And in that unspoken moment, the contract felt fragile for the first time, like glass that could shatter with the smallest touch. The house had a way of swallowing sound, but that morning the silence was broken by the sharp crash of porcelain against marble. Sophie stood frozen as shards of her favorite mug scattered at her feet, coffee bleeding across the white floor like a spreading shadow. Her chest tightened, hands trembling. She expected the sharp sting of words, the kind that had once followed every accident in her past. But no voice came. Instead, Gabriel appeared suddenly in the doorway, his presence so sudden it made her flinch. He crossed the room with quick, precise movements, dropping to one knee without hesitation. His hands moved with the same certainty he carried in a boardroom, gathering shards of glass carefully, each fragment gleaming under the light. For the first time since their contract had been signed, his skin brushed hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent shock through her like a current. Sophie recoiled instantly, pulling back with such force that the edge of the broken mug sliced her palm. A bead of crimson welled, bright and fragile against her pale skin. Gabriel stilled. His eyes flicked to the cut, then back to her face. He said nothing, not a word of anger, not even comfort. He rose smoothly, set the fragments in the trash, and left the kitchen. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her in silence once more. But that night, when she returned to her room, a small box waited by the door. A first aid kit. No note, no signature, only quiet acknowledgement that he had seen her, that he had cared enough to do something without breaking the rules of their contract. Sophie sat on her bed, staring at the kit for a long time. The gesture was simple, almost clinical, but it was also the first kindness she had received in years that asked for nothing in return. She pressed her bandaged hand against her chest, and for the first time she wondered if distance and silence were not the same thing. Days slipped by in uneasy rhythm. Dinners were still quiet, but no longer unbearable. Sometimes she caught his eyes lingering on her hands, as though he remembered the scrape of porcelain against skin. Sometimes she noticed his footsteps outside her door late at night, slow and deliberate, never stopping, never intruding, but always there. And sometimes she heard the faint strain of jazz floating from his wing, notes low and restless, filling the mansion with a melancholy she did not expect from a man made of steel. One evening the storm returned. Sophie walked out onto the terrace barefoot, her hair wild in the rain. She lifted her face to the sky, letting the thunder drown out the noise in her head. Inside the house, Gabriel stood at the glass, watching her silhouette framed in lightning. His hand hovered near the door, but he did not open it. He did not call her back. He only watched, and for the first time something in his chest tightened in a way he could not name. The contract between them was still intact, its lines unbroken on paper. Yet in the silence of shattered porcelain, in the unspoken gesture of a first aid kit, in the distance of a storm seen through glass, a new kind of tension was born. It was not desire, not yet, but it was dangerous all the same. Because once silence begins to change, it is only a matter of time before it breaks. The storm did not leave quickly that night. It lingered heavy over the hills, rolling thunder across the sky until the glass walls of the mansion seemed to tremble with every strike of lightning. Sophie stood by her window barefoot, her hands pressed against the cool pane, watching the rain cascade down like endless rivers. She should have gone to bed, but something inside her refused to rest. It was the same restless energy that had haunted her for years, the memory of a voice that once turned storms into cages. She whispered to herself that this was different, that here no one would touch her, no one would demand, no one would break the rules. From the east wing, a sound drifted through the silence, music low, soft, not classical as she once imagined he would prefer, but jazz slow and bruised, like a confession. He was alone. She could tell each note carried the weight of someone who never let himself speak aloud. Sophie sat cross-legged on her bed and listened. Her heart beat in rhythm with the saxophone, the trumpet, the pause between notes. She wondered if he knew she could hear it, and for the first time she did not mind the silence between them because the music filled it. The next morning a small package waited on the kitchen counter beside the coffee pot, chamomile tea. Sophie touched it with careful fingers as though it might vanish. There was no note, but she remembered her sleepless nights, her footsteps echoing through the house when she thought no one noticed. He had noticed. That evening when Gabriel returned from his 12-hour day at Whitmore Holdings, he found her already seated at the dining table, not waiting exactly, but present. When he sat down, she lifted her eyes and said softly, "Thank you." His hand stilled over his fork. "For what?" She nodded toward the tea. "For helping me sleep." He said nothing at first, then with a quiet certainty, "You weren't sleeping." She did not ask how he knew, and he did not explain, but the silence that followed was no longer cold. It was alive. Later that week, she found herself in the kitchen again, reaching for a glass from the top shelf. She stretched high on her toes, her fingers brushing the rim just as it slipped. Her breath caught, ready for the crash. But before it could shatter, Gabriel's hand darted out, catching it mid-fall, his reflexes sharp, his grip steady. He set the glass gently on the counter, but when Sophie turned, their faces were close, too close. Her breath hitched her chest, brushed his arm. She froze and then stepped back quickly, heat rushing to her cheeks. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head, voice low. "It's fine. No harm done." He left the room, but something lingered in the air, something unspoken, something dangerous. That night, Sophie could not sleep. The image of his hand catching the glass replayed again and again the way he had looked at her, not with cruelty, not even with desire, but with something else, something steady and unguarded. In the east wing, the music played again, a little louder this time, as though he wanted the sound to reach her. And lying in the dark, Sophie realized the most dangerous thing about silence was not the emptiness. It was what began to grow inside it once someone started to listen. It was past midnight when the scream shattered the mansion's stillness. Gabriel woke instantly, his pulse hammering in his chest. For a moment he thought it was the storm outside, but the thunder had already passed. The sound was different, raw and human, a cry carved out of fear. It came from the west wing, from her room. He did not think of the contract. He did not think of rules. His feet were already moving across the marble floor, bare and silent. The closer he came, the sharper the sound became, muffled words, broken gasps. Sophie's voice pleading, "Stop! Daniel, please stop!" Gabriel pushed open her door without hesitation. Moonlight spilled across the bed where she twisted, tangled in the sheets. Her skin glistened with sweat, her fists clenched, her breath caught in uneven sobs. She fought shadows that only she could see. Gabriel froze for a heartbeat, watching her thrash, caught between her past and the present. The name she cried was one she had never spoken aloud, but he understood enough. His chest tightened with something fierce, protective. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Sophie, wake up. It's a dream. You're safe." She did not stir. Her cries sharpened her hands, clawing at the air. Without thinking, he reached out, breaking every clause of the agreement. His palm brushed her shoulder, gently steady. "Sophie." His voice broke softer this time. "It's over. You're not there anymore." She recoiled even in sleep, her body trembling like a fragile wire on the edge of snapping. Tears streaked down her cheeks. She whimpered, no, again and again. Gabriel felt his throat constrict. A man who had built his life on steel walls now found himself kneeling beside a woman breaking in her dreams. He did the only thing his instincts allowed. He climbed onto the bed, careful not to startle her, not to press too close and lay above the blankets. He slipped an arm around her frame, not to claim but to shield. Her body tensed, then slowly locked it against him. Her breathing, uneven, at first began to match the rhythm of his chest, her fists unclenched. Her cries turned into whispers until silence settled. Her face buried near his heart, her trembling softened into sleep. Gabriel stared at the ceiling, unmoving, afraid to break the fragile peace. For hours he held her, listening to her breath, the quiet rise and fall of someone who had not slept safely in years. When dawn crept through the windows, Sophie stirred. Her lashes fluttered and she blinked at the warmth around her. She realized his arm was still there, holding her steady. Her eyes widened, but she did not scream. She whispered instead. "You stayed." Gabriel's voice was rough. "I heard you. You were scared." She looked at him uncertain, confused. "I don't remember falling asleep." He nodded quietly. "You were safe." She glanced at his arm, ready for him to move away, but instead, her fingers touched his sleeve hesitantly for only a second. That touch was enough. In that moment, the contract that had kept them apart no longer felt like law. It felt like paper already turning to ash. And as Gabriel looked into her tired eyes, he realized a truth that unsettled him deeply. The most dangerous rule to break was not about touch. It was about what came after, when two people who promised distance began to discover how much they needed closeness. The night after Gabriel broke the contract, the mansion did not feel the same. The walls still whispered and the halls still echoed. But there was something in the air, a shift that could not be unseen. Sophie lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the memory of his arm around her, the steady heartbeat that had lulled her back from the edge of terror. She should have been afraid of what it meant. Instead, she felt something more dangerous, a longing for it to happen again. When Gabriel knocked on her door the following evening, he did not ask. He simply said softly, "Are you all right?" She hesitated, her body tense, her voice caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, "Yes." But when he turned to leave, she called out, "Wait." She did not look at him as she added, "Would you stay again?" His silence stretched heavy in the air. Then he answered, "Of course." That night he lay on the covers, his body still in its armor of restraint while she turned on her side, facing away from him. But she slept without waking, and in the morning her eyes were softer. It became their ritual. Gabriel knocked every night, and every night Sophie whispered yes. At first it was only for the nightmares, but soon she realized she wanted him there even when she slept peacefully. He never crossed a line, never touched her unless her trembling hand reached first. He lay still like a sentinel guarding the silence, but the silence itself had changed. It was no longer the silence of distance. It was the silence of trust. Days grew different too. Dinners lasted longer. Her footsteps in the halls no longer hurried away from his presence. Sometimes she caught him looking at her hands again, the way her fingers curled nervously around a fork, and instead of turning away, she held his gaze for a second longer. One evening, her voice broke the quiet at the table. "Do you like what you do?" He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. His eyes narrowed as if no one he had ever asked him such a question. He thought for a moment, then answered, "I don't know. I have been doing it so long I never asked myself." She nodded quietly, and then whispered, I used to paint. His gaze flicked to the faint color stains that lingered at the edges of her nails. You still do, he said softly. Her breath caught at the truth in his words. That night she opened a dusty box and touched a brush again for the first time in years. The bristles trembled in her grip, but she pressed them into paint and let a single stroke of blue spread across a canvas. Her heart raced with fear and freedom. Gabriel, passing her door, hours later noticed the faint glow of light and said nothing, but something inside him eased. In the weeks that followed, the mansion began to breathe differently. Jazz spilled more often from his wing, and Sophie let the music guide her brushes. She laughed once in the kitchen when Gabriel spilled orange juice on a stack of reports. The sound startled them both, but he found himself smiling with her. That smile lingered as long as her laughter did, and so the house that had once been carved from silence now carried the first fragile notes of change. Each night they shared the same room. Each day they inched closer to something unnamed. Sophie told herself it was only presence. Gabriel told himself it was only protection. But deep down they both knew that something far more dangerous was stirring. And when silence begins to carry warmth, it is only a matter of time before it turns into fire. The invitation came in a heavy white envelope sealed with gold script. Sophie found it waiting beside her morning tea. Her name, written in elegant letters, felt like a warning more than a welcome. Inside lay the request from Victoria Whitmore. Gabriel's mother commanding their presence at the Whitmore Foundation annual gala. Sophie's stomach tightened. She could already imagine the chandeliers, the cameras, the whispers, a battlefield dressed in diamonds. That evening, Gabriel found her curled on the sofa, the invitation untouched on the table. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to her. He spoke with quiet certainty. I will not make you go, but my mother expects it. Sophie lifted her gaze, searching his expression. Is this about you, or about her? He paused, then answered evenly. It is about us. The world needs to believe we are solid. She swallowed her fear before whispering, And are we? He hesitated, then said softly, We are getting there. The week that followed was a blur of fittings and preparation. A stylist arrived, bringing gowns. Sophie tried to resist, but Gabriel's steady voice persuaded her. You should feel strong, not exposed. She stood before the mirror in a soft champagne dress, the fabric glowing against her skin. For the first time, she did not look like someone hiding. She looked like someone stepping into light. On the night of the gala, Gabriel waited at the base of the stairs in a black tuxedo, his presence sharp and commanding. But when his eyes lifted to her, something changed. His breath caught his composure, faltered, and his words came unguarded. You are radiant. She gave a small nervous smile and whispered, Do not let go of my hand. He leaned closer, his voice firm. I will not. No matter what. Flashbulbs erupted as soon as they stepped from the car. Questions crashed through the air. Gabriel. Over here. Is this your wife? Mrs. Whitmore, look this way. Sophie's heart pounded, but Gabriel's grip on. Her hand was steady. He led her through the chaos, his calm strength shielding her from the frenzy. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers glowed like stars above polished marble floors. Victoria descended the grand staircase, every inch a queen. She greeted Gabriel with a cool kiss, then turned to Sophie with a smile, sharp as glass. You clean up beautifully. Let us hope you hold your own tonight. Before Sophie could reply, Gabriel's voice cut through calm but edged. She is here as my wife, not as a performance. The whispers began almost instantly. Who is she? Where did she come from? Not exactly. Whitmore material. Sophie straightened her back, forcing her shoulders not to fold. Then from across the room, another figure approached. Travis Gabriel's cousin, charming and poisonous. His smile was all velvet, but his eyes glittered with knives. Well, if it isn't the happy couple, he said smoothly. Sophie, isn't it? We have heard so little about you. She met his gaze steady. I imagine that was intentional. Travis smirked feisty. I wonder how long that will last. Gabriel shifted slightly, his hand brushing the small of her back. Support without possession, but the true blow came in the garden where she went to breathe beneath the cool night air. The music of the quartet drifted behind her, Gabriel by her side. Then she froze, her entire body locked in terror. Near the fountain stood a man with a smile she knew too well. Daniel. The name scraped her throat as a whisper. Her abuser. The past she thought she had escaped. Gabriel felt her hand go rigid. His eyes followed her gaze and his jaw clenched. "Who is that?" she whispered. "Daniel?" Her knees weakened. The world blurred. Gabriel stepped instantly between them, shielding her. His voice was low and fierce. "Stay here." She clutched his arm desperately. "No, please do not leave me alone." He looked down at her, saw the terror in her eyes, and something inside him broke. For the first time he forgot. The contract, the distance, the rules. He pulled her against him in front of everyone, his arm firm around her trembling frame. This was no performance, it was protection. The gala sparkled on around them, but Sophie felt only the steady strength of Gabriel's embrace as he whispered into her hair. "You are safe. I will not let him near you." And for the first time in years, surrounded by judgment and ghosts, she believed it. The drive back from the gala was wrapped in silence, but it was not the silence they had known before. This one was jagged, full of unsaid words. Sophie pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the car window, her body trembling as if the sight of Daniel still lingered in her skin. Gabriel sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his hand resting on his knee, unmoving. He wanted to reach for her, but he knew if he did, it had to be when she was ready. When they reached the mansion, Sophie climbed the stairs quickly, her gown whispering along the floor. Gabriel followed at a distance, afraid that if he let her disappear behind a locked door, he might lose her to shadows forever. But at her doorway, she paused, her hand gripping the frame without turning. She whispered, "Will you come in?" He stepped forward without hesitation. "Of course." She sat at the edge of her bed, her robe draped loosely over her shoulders, her hair falling like a curtain. She would not look at him at first. Her voice was hollow as she spoke. "I need to tell you all of it." She drew a shaky breath. "I do not expect you to fix it, but I do not want to hide anymore." Gabriel lowered himself into the armchair across from her and waited. His silence was not passive, it was permission. Sophie's hands trembled in her lap as she began. "I was 19 when I met him. Daniel. He was older, confident. He made me feel like I mattered. At first he was kind. He told me I was gifted, that my paintings meant something. But then it changed. Little by little he tore me apart with words. He said I was too sensitive, too weak, too foolish. He isolated me until I believed no one else would ever want me." Her voice cracked. "He never hit me in ways people expect, but he made me disappear piece by piece." Gabriel's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. He let her pour the poison out of her chest. She wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. "I left him, but I never stopped being afraid. I promised myself I would never let anyone close again." Her gaze finally lifted, meeting his. "Until you." The words carved into him like fire. Gabriel leaned forward, his voice low and raw. "Sophie, what he did was cruelty, not truth. You were never broken. The fact that you walked away makes you stronger than he will ever be." She broke, then a sob slipping past her lips. Gabriel rose and knelt in front of her slowly, as though afraid to startle her. He reached for her hand. This time she did not pull away. His voice was steady. "I need you to know something. This marriage was never supposed to matter. You were supposed to be safe distance, but you do matter more than anything." Her eyes glistened with tears. He squeezed her hand gently. "I will not let him near you again. I promise." Sophie's voice trembled. He was invited. Someone wanted him there. Gabriel's expression darkened, his voice like steel. "Then I will find out who, and when I do, they will never touch your life again." That night she did not ask him to sleep on top of the covers. She pulled back the blanket without a word. He lay beside her, fully clothed, careful and steady. When her fingers reached for his, he laced them together, not just to hold her hand, but to hold her grief, her rage, her strength. She whispered into the dark, "I do not want to be afraid anymore." He pressed his lips to her temple. "You will not be. Not while I breathe." In the shadows of the room, Sophie felt something shift. She had handed him the truth, and instead of turning away, he had stayed. She realized then that the most powerful vow is not spoken under chandeliers but whispered in the dark. I will stay. And Gabriel Whitmore, the man who had built his life on rules and distance, had just broken them all for her. The evidence came to Gabriel before sunrise, a folder thick with emails, phone records, and meeting logs. His suspicions had been right. Daniel had not simply appeared at the gala. He had been invited, and the hand that had opened the door for him was not a stranger. It was family. Travis, his cousin, the same man who had smiled at Sophie with velvet words and a knife behind his teeth. Gabriel stared at the papers, his blood running cold. It was not just betrayal. It was calculated war. By the time Sophie woke, the mansion had already changed. Security was doubled, every entrance monitored, staff questioned, cameras repositioned. Gabriel was a man who thrived in control, but this was different. It was not about business. It was about her. When Sophie stepped into the kitchen, still in her robe, her hair tangled from sleep, she saw a man in a dark suit near the door. She frowned. Who is he? Gabriel looked up from his tablet. His name is Ben. He will stay here to protect you. She blinked, startled. You hired a bodyguard? 2, actually, he said gently. 1 for the house and 1 for anywhere you go. Sophie's breath caught. You did not ask. He shook his head. I did not have to. After what happened, this is not about choice. It is about peace of mind. That evening, Gabriel showed her the folder. He placed it on the table between them, her hands trembling as she opened it. Line after line revealed the truth. Travis had lured Daniel in and timed it precisely to humiliate her, to shake Gabriel's focus before the board's most critical vote. Sophie's chest tightened as she flipped each page. He used me, she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were hard. He thought I would break. Gabriel's gaze held hers. He thought wrong, but he underestimated both of us. The next morning, the boardroom was a battlefield. 12 men and women sat in stiff suits, the skyline of Manhattan looming behind them. Gabriel stood at the head of the table, calm, awed, and sharp. Sophie sat at his side no longer. The silent shadow she once was, but a presence steady and unflinching. Travis leaned back, smirking, as though victory still belonged to him. Can we get to the vote? He asked casually. This meeting feels unnecessary. Gabriel's voice was cool, measured. Before we vote, we address sabotage. He pressed a button, and the screen behind him lit up. Emails, texts, recordings. Evidence lined in black and white. Travis's face paled, but he forced a laugh. Accusations without weight. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. Audio played, filling the room. Travis's own voice sneering. She's his soft spot. You get in her head and he will crumble. They are fragile. She is damaged goods. Silence fell thick as stone. Sophie's heart pounded, but she rose to her feet. The room's eyes followed her. She spoke not loudly, but with a voice that cut through every whisper. I was invited to that gala to be destroyed. The man you heard on that tape was my abuser. I walked away from him years ago, but someone here decided to weaponize my past. She steadied her breath. I am not here for revenge. I am here for truth. You can vote today for numbers, for legacy, for profit, or you can decide what this company really stands for. Integrity or rot. The board members shifted, unsettled. Gabriel's chest tightened with pride as he looked at her. She was no longer the woman hiding in shadows. She was fire contained in flesh. The chair cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, your recommendation. Gabriel's voice was steel. I move to suspend Travis. Whitmore, effective immediately. Security appeared. Travis stood, his mask of charm crumbling. He glared at Sophie as he was let out, but she did not look away. Not this time. When the room finally emptied, Gabriel pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. The contract. The rules that had once bound them. He held it up between them, and then, without a word, set it alight in the boardroom fireplace. The fall. Ames ate it quickly, curling the edges to ash. Sophie watched the paper burn, her eyes glistening. She whispered softly, Then it is over. Gabriel shook his head. No, he said, it is only beginning. The night after the boardroom fire, the mansion felt different. The silence that once pressed against every wall now seemed lighter, as though the house itself had exhaled. Sophie walked barefoot through the halls, the scent of smoke from the burned contract still faint in the air. Gabriel stood in his study, staring into the fireplace where the ashes remained. His world had been built on rules and distance, but he had destroyed them with his own hand. And now he wondered what came next. The answer arrived in the form of a note left on Sophie's easel, written in his precise hand. "Wear something soft. Meet me in the garden." She raised an eyebrow when she read it, but curiosity pulled her outside. The rain had just begun to fall, soft and steady. Lanterns lined the path, casting a golden glow against the wet stone. At the arbor where jasmine bloomed wild, Gabriel waited. He was not the untouchable CEO tonight. No tie, no armor, only a black sweater, his hair damp from rain. In his hand, a small velvet box. Sophie froze as her heart stumbled. Gabriel stepped forward, his voice unsteady. "This is not strategy. This is not for appearances. We married once for paper, but that was never real. Tonight, I am asking you for everything." He lowered to one knee, opening the box. A simple band rested inside, engraved with a brushstroke. Her brushstroke. "Sophie Lane," he whispered. "You came into my life as silence and became the only voice I needed. You showed me that love is not weakness. It is survival. It is fire, and it is peace. Will you marry me again this time for forever?" Her breath caught the world blurred around her. Rain slid down her face, mixing with tears. She fell to her knees with him, whispering, "Yes, yes, Gabriel." She pressed her forehead to his as he slid the ring onto her finger, not with ceremony, but with reverence. Then his mouth found hers, and the kiss was not rushed, not desperate. It was a vow sealed in rain, exactly on. A month later, the garden was alive with spring. Their second wedding was nothing like the first. No marble courthouse, no photographers, only 10 guests, a flower-lined aisle, and vows whispered beneath the jasmine arbor. Sophie wore an ivory dress she had sewn herself, each hem painted with wildflowers. Gabriel wore a linen shirt, his sleeves rolled bare feet in the grass. They stood hand in hand, Sophie's voice trembling but strong. "I vow to never hide again, to show up whole or broken, and to love you without fear." Gabriel's eyes burned as he answered, "I vow to protect you without caging you, to love you even when silence returns, and especially when it does." When they kissed, the applause was soft but full of belonging. Years later, the house was no longer quiet. It pulsed with life. Laughter of children. Footsteps racing down hallways, the scent of cinnamon rolls and paint. Sophie's studio glowed with canvases of color. Gabriel's study no longer felt like a fortress, but a home. Lucas, serious and curious with his father's brow. Ella, wild and joyful with her mother's. Fire ran across the garden while their parents watched hand in hand. Sophie leaned against Gabriel, whispering, "Do you think the past ever really disappears?" He pressed a kiss into her hair. "No, but we learned to carry it differently." She smiled softly. "And now we live in color." In that moment, Sophie knew their story had never been about contracts or rules. It had been about survival, transforming into love, about silence becoming presence, and presence becoming forever. She had once thought she was marrying a man of stone, but she had discovered someone who could hold her through nightmares and teach her to dream again. And Gabriel, once terrified of love, had found that the only thing more powerful than control was choosing to stay.